All right, let's go ahead and get at it. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to start with the elasticity chapter. I know we've got just a little bit left in terms of consumer and producer surplus, and we were talking about market efficiency. And we'll kind of finish that up on Monday. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and get right into elasticity, and we'll probably knock out quite a bit of this. So tonight is Thursday night, so you can certainly see this tomorrow, which will be Friday, Saturday, Sunday, sometime over the weekend. Just make sure you've seen it before we jump into things on Monday. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about elasticity. Now, one of the things to kind of keep in mind when you think about elasticity, elasticity is just kind of what you think is stretching and flexibility and moving and markets being dynamic, all right, that type of thing. But what you're thinking of also is change and the rate of change, right? So one thing changes and does another thing change, right? What is the reaction, okay? So if you think about a certain action around the world, right? What does that do to something else? So let me give you a couple of examples, all right? Let's say war breaks out in the Middle East, right? Middle Eastern countries, of course, have a lot in the way of oil. They produce a lot of oil. They sell it around the world. But what happens if war might interrupt some of those supply chains, right? Some of those distribution chains, or even production itself, right? And trying to get the stuff out of the ground, all right? That will increase the price of crude oil, therefore increasing the price of gasoline. What would happen to demand, right? Okay, let's give you another example. Let's say the economy in China is raging along, right? China is a producer, right? They make stuff, they manufacture stuff, they need crude oil. So let's say, right, China's production goes sky high, right? That will certainly increase demand, right? What happens to price? Okay, all right. And then lastly, let's say, for instance, Congress imposes a new gasoline tax, right? Something happens. What happens to the price of gasoline? Well, it'll go up as soon as you throw on the tax. What happens to the demand? Well, in theory, of course, if the price goes up, demand will very well go down. Okay, now those are things we know, right? The question that we're going to wrestle with now is how much? What's the magnitude? How elastic is the change? What is the reaction? That kind of thing. All right. So, we talked about this stuff. What will Americans do, right? So let's say, again, for whatever reason, could be those three reasons, the price of crude oil goes up. We know the price of gasoline will go up. What will Americans do, right? Are they going to start walking to work, ride a bicycle? Are they going to buy more efficient automobiles, maybe electric automobiles, something like that? Maybe not Tesla anytime soon if you've seen today's news. Okay, but nonetheless, all right, we're expecting their behavior to change. The demand for that gasoline, as we see pressure on the price go up, how much is that demand going to go? How much is the demand going to change, and in what direction? Okay, so when you think about this stuff, all right, so I'm a little under the weather, but I'm still going to fight through it. Okay, so you think about two particular questions when it comes to elasticity, right? The first one, right, is the direction. All right, the direction of change, right? Price goes up, what's going to happen to demand? Well, we would expect it to go down, right? Okay, so that just kind of makes sense, all right? And this is all intuition. The direction question itself is all intuition, right? The bigger one, for our purposes, is really the magnitude, right? How big of a change? Right? How big of a change are we going to see? Right? Is it a 50%? Is it a 30%? Something of that nature. So let's say, for instance, we could show, right, that a 10 cents per gallon increase, right, led to a 20% decrease. I'll get out of the way of the camera here. All right. Would lead to a 20% decrease in demand, right? Well, that's pretty significant, but what if I said 30%? What if I said 40%, right? Well, the demand, or the direction is still the same, right? But the magnitude is certainly different, right? It's growing, it's getting bigger. And of course, if I went the other way, someone says, yeah, well, you know, direction is what we'd expect, but man, it just wasn't that much of one, okay? All right, so that's really what we're looking at. Okay, so let's go ahead and focus on the elasticity of demand, and then eventually we'll get into the elasticity of supply. It's a little bit of a different issue, but I think it's always good to start with the elasticity of demand. I think it's easier. I think it's something we can understand a little bit more. Okay, let me just give myself some room here on the board. Okay, I'm going to have this wire kind of constantly in front of me, but we'll make do. Okay, so let's talk about the price elasticity of demand. Here's our expectation. Our intuition is always based on the law of demand, right? As price goes up, right? Demand is going to go down, right? That's a funky looking E, I know, but all right, demand's going to go. That's the law, right? We always assume that. Now, however, let's look at these two other terms. Elastic and inelastic, right? Now, let's go with another color here, all right? If it's elastic, we're going to say there's a substantial change. Big, all right? Now, we don't have to define substantial. We don't have to say the magnitude has to be 5, all right? We don't have to do that, all right? Everything is relative, all right? And of course, if it's inelastic, you know, maybe a little overkill. Well, the magnitude, the change, it's not substantial. Yeah, it's important, it's a big deal, but it's not that big, right? It's not that big a deal. Okay. Now, again, there's no hard line rule, all right, as to what's substantial and what's not substantial. It's all relative. As you might imagine, a change in the price of airline tickets would be different than the price, a price change in a gallon of gasoline, right? So it just, you know, it's all relative. Okay. However, with that said, we're going to talk about again, every demand curve is unique. So, you know, this is really overkill, but we'll just do it. You know, the reasons for this demand curve right there, it could be psychological, social, not just purely economic. And again, we're drawing a lot on what Greg Mankiw has done. I mean, he's done a pretty good job of presenting this kind of stuff. Okay. So let's look at 4 factors that we know will address, right, whether something is elastic or inelastic in terms of change, right? Whether the demand is elastic or inelastic. So I'm going to go with just these 4 factors, and they're in your outline. But what I want to do is also build on some relationships here. Okay, number 1, the availability of substitutes. The greater the availability of substitutes, the more elastic. Okay? The greater the availability of substitutes, right, the more elastic. Okay? Now, when it comes to availability, we really look at 2 things. Okay? Availability is based on, does it work and can I get it, right? So, is it going to be a really good substitute, butter for margarine, coffee for tea, that kind of thing? And can I get it? Well, if you think butter and margarine, yeah, you can find either one of those 2 things just about everywhere. And coffee and tea, yeah, you can find them just about anywhere, right? We're going to assume that they're close in price, right? But it's going to work out, right? It's going to work out, okay? There'd be a big difference between a lawnmower, right, and a pair of scissors to cut your grass, right? I mean, those 2 things really wouldn't work. But again, kind of a ridiculous example, I admit, but nonetheless, I think it shows the point. Okay, but again, close in price, is it going to work, right? Is it going to work for me? Is it going to do what I need it to do? And can I get it, right? Can I get it? So again, the more close substitutes, if you will, right, they work, right, the more elastic, okay? Now, excuse me. The second that I want to look at is the difference between necessities and luxury items, okay? Now, necessities, frankly, are just inelastic, all right? You need them. Price changes, it doesn't matter, you're going to go get it, right? Think of food, basic clothing, basic shelter, right? Could be services, you know, if you rent an apartment, that's actually really a service, it's not so much a good. All right, but the idea is that, you know, you need it, you have to have food, and gasoline is a pretty good example as well, all right? And I'm going to use gasoline throughout this because I think gasoline just does a pretty good job of explaining a lot of these points. Okay, so necessities, food staples, bread, milk, butter, that kind of thing. You know, you could actually think about some of the close substitutes associated with some of those necessities, like almond milk, which I find disgusting, soy milk, ugh. Anyway, but some of those other things, butter, margarine, etc., you get the idea. Okay, now luxury goods. Luxury goods have very elastic demand associated with them. Fur coats, right? You don't need a fur coat. You need a coat, but you don't need a fur coat. Sports cars. You need a car, but you don't need a sports car. All right, those are things that are going to have a lot of elastic demand. All right, price change, and people will say, you know, I'm just not doing that. Right, I'll go with a close substitute. I don't need a fur coat. I just need something to stay warm. I'll just get like a normal coat. Okay, now third, and this gets a little trickier, I admit. All right, and that's the definition of a market. Okay, so what market are we looking at? So, you know, we look at this. I could draw in a supply curve, just a small one. We'll do some drawing here in a minute. All right. But if you think about the market, right? Food. If food's your market, that's probably too broad to really make some broad stroke statements about elasticity. But what about milk, right? A type of food, right? Or bread, a type of food. The narrower the scope of the market, the easier it is to determine elasticity versus inelasticity, right? And that's the relationship that I want you to get down, all right? The narrower the market, the narrower the focus, right? And this is what commodities economists do all the time, right? Grains, wheats, oats, that type of stuff. The narrower the market, the easier to determine whether elasticity or inelasticity really, whether it exists. Okay, and lastly is the time horizon. Now I'm going to give you a baseline rule and then kind of chop things up a little bit. All goods, right? All of them, necessities, luxuries, doesn't matter, all right? All goods in the long run have elastic demand. All goods in the long run have an elastic demand, right? The reason why is that in the long run, people really can change their behavior. They can do different things. They've got time to react, all right? So with that said, and kind of chopping things up a little bit, throughout this chapter, we're really going to focus on the short run, okay? We're really going to focus on the short run. I'll let you know when things become different and we go in a different direction, that's fine, and we start talking about the long run, but we're going to chop things up and really look at things in the short run. So when I give you these examples of some basic demand curves associated with elasticity as we try to frame it, if you will, all right, excuse me. We're looking at the short run. I mean, think about it. I mean, people can always change in time. Technology changes. I mean, things are always going to change. Okay, now, what I want to do is just quickly look at just kind of a baseline equation to determine elasticity. Now, we're going to do it in a couple of different ways. I just kind of want you to get the magnitude down so I can set up our discussion on, on the actual curve. So kind of determining not only magnitude, but also slope, which is going to become a little bit important here in a minute. Okay, so give you just a down and dirty equation. Price, elasticity of demand, okay? Pretty simple, all right. Okay, now we use delta, right, triangle, so percentage change, excuse me, in quantity demanded divided by, right, percentage change, better triangle there, in price. Okay, so let's go back to the example that I gave you a little bit ago, right? So, in fact, let me go up here. I got my other colors over there, so don't worry too much. All right, so let's say we had that's not very good, a 10%, all right? Let me do better than that. Okay. Here we go, a 10% increase in price, all right? And it was followed by, all right, a 20% drop, all right, in demand. Okay. All right. Now, I've kind of figured that part out for you, and things will get a little bit more complex here in a bit. Okay. But essentially, I already know there's a 20%, excuse me, there's a 20%, right, drop in demand, 10% increase in price, right? And essentially, we would have a magnitude of 2. Now, mathematically, if we're being, pure mathematicians, this would actually be a negative number, okay? Because it's a 20% drop, and the answer would be a negative 2. However, we work in absolute values, if you remember from some of the other problems we've looked at, right? And essentially, we're looking for the absolute value of that, so it would essentially be 2. So, that would be significant. Now, let's say, just for argument's sake, I can actually draw it in. All right, it's a 30% drop. The answer would be negative 3. We take the absolute value, all right, and it'd be 3. Actually, we wouldn't put the absolute value there again. All right, okay. Now, what that would show is that we had greater magnitude, right? This relationship would be more significant. So, as economists, we would dig deeper. We would want to know why consumers are so much more sensitive to price changes in gasoline. It's like, why are they so sensitive? All right, let's say it went to 40%, 50%. It doesn't matter. We just scratch our heads like, why are they so sensitive? That doesn't make any sense. All right, maybe something's changing out there. Maybe something's out there. Maybe they're all driving SUVs and they're gas guzzlers, and something's going on. Now, again, in the short run, if you've already bought the SUV, there might not be a whole lot you can do. Okay, now with that said, all right, let's get a little bit more technical, if you will. All right, and what we're going to do is go through, excuse me, what we call the midpoint method, all right? Okay, I think ManQ does a great job on this one. Okay, now, just as an example, let's say we had 2 points, right? 2 relationships, 2 points, something like that, okay? All right, so, and this could be, imagine these being on a graph, and let's say A was a price of $4 and a quantity demanded figure of 120, and we had B with a price of, say, $6 and a quantity demanded of 80. And that would make a little bit of sense, right? In the sense that, at $4 you want a little bit more versus, higher price, you're probably going to want a little bit less. Okay, now, if you said maybe we're going to go from A to B, right? Just looking at A to B, we'd be looking at change in quantity over the change in price, and it would look something like this. Right? And your answer essentially would be something like that. Okay, but let's say we wanted to go from B to A, right? Just the change in quantity or the change in price, and the numbers would be just a little jumbled, right? Okay, and you're like, okay, no, wait a minute, that didn't make any sense. Okay, we're just going from one point to one point. So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce a formula that'll help us from this particular problem. Because again, it's 2 points. It's like, well, wait a minute. Why would the magnitude be any different? All right, and the reason it's different is we're looking at it from 2 different bases. All right, okay. So let's go ahead and look at the midpoint method. Oops. All right. Okay, so, all right, so let me go ahead and give you the formula. And you know what, let me move it up a little bit. All right, so this is the midpoint formula. All right, now, essentially, I just kind of like to do this for my students. All right, you're really looking at 3 fractions, one up here, and then putting it all together. Okay, so essentially what we're going to do, right, yeah, drop it down a little bit here. Okay, all right, is we're going to look at the quantities, right, find a difference, but then also add them together and divide by 2, getting the midpoint. Same thing with prices, right, finding the difference, but then in the denominator, adding the 2 together, right, then dividing by 2, getting the average, finding that midpoint. Okay, so essentially, let's say we had the same points, right? We had, 4 and 80, and we had 6 and 120, which made sense. You know, this is price and quantity, right? Okay. All right, so we'll just go ahead and plug it in, right? All right, and 6 and 4, right? Okay, let me bring this back just a little bit. Okay, all right. So essentially we would just take it out. In fact, I'll go this way, if you will, all right? Okay, all right. Now that actually reduces to 2/5 as well. So this is way overkill, right? And essentially you'd have an answer of 1. It's actually unit elasticity, okay? All right, so nonetheless, this is the way I'd want you to calculate it, right? So if I was asking you to calculate elasticity, right, that's the way I would want you to use the midpoint method. Now, by the way, you could actually flip these as 1 and 2. You just have to stay consistent throughout the equation, all right? And when we get back on Monday, we'll play around with that a little bit more. I'll give you an in-class exercise to kind of wrestle with it. Okay, now, so again, that would, and again, if it's, you know, one that's pretty telltale, I think that, you know, if you find that magnitude of 1, right, pretty significant. Okay, all right, so, actually, it's negative, the answer is actually -1, but the absolute value being 1. All right. Okay, now what I want you to do, give yourself some space on your notes, because what we're going to do is we're going to go through what I'm going to call the variety of demand curves, just so you can kind of get a feel for what elasticity looks like in a graph in regard to a demand curve. Okay, now what I want to give you, however, is just a couple of rules of thumb before we go any further. Okay, so we'll just kind of do this. We're going to look at something that's flatter. So you can kind of look at trends, right? Excuse me. And steeper, right? Flatter and steeper. Okay. All right. Flatter, you see greater elasticity. All right. So the flatter, greater elasticity. Steeper, all right, lower elasticity, all right, or in other words, inelastic, right? Again, this is really, really overkill, but we'll just... Okay, now, the other thing to kind of keep in mind, right, is that demand curves can change, all right? So let's just say, for argument's sake, let me just go ahead and put one right over here, all right? It's a graph, and, this is price and quantity demanded. And we'll go with blue, right? Okay, what if I gave you something like, all right, that for a demand curve, right? Well, what we'd see is that at low levels of quantity demanded, right, and higher prices, well, inelastic, 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 and then boom, right, things become very, very elastic. Okay, so that's possible, right? That's possible, and as an economist, if you saw this, then you'd have to dig deeper. Well, this is really overkill, but you'd say, well, why is this the case here? Why is this the case here? And then maybe, why did that break? What was the actual price? What was happening at this price level? And again, when we ask what was happening, well, you're not going to find that out by just looking at the curve. Then you got to dig a little bit deeper, do your research, that kind of thing. So something that's a little bit below. So again, flatter, more elastic. That means people are like freaking out. I got to go do something else. I got to go find that close substitute, right? Maybe it's a luxury good, that type of thing. Steeper, hey, I'm stuck. No matter, again, here, I'm stuck. I can't freak out. Even if I want to freak out, it's not going to do me any good. I'm going to have to just learn to adjust. Okay, so we'll do a little graphing here. So give yourself some space. All right, give yourself some space, all right, your notes, if you will. Okay, all right, so we won't make these too detailed, but we will try to stay consistent if we can. Okay, and just what you would think, price, quantity demanded, right, no change there, and one. Maybe we'll be able to save some of these without having to redo them. Oops. Hang on. All right. Okay, so let's say, get some purple here. Write it. Now imagine this is a perfectly, it's not, but imagine this is a perfectly vertical line, right? And maybe let's salt and pepper. Let's put some blue in here. Okay, imagine this is P1, right? At $4, you're going to buy 100, right? At $4, you're going to buy 100. Now let's say we raise the price to 6. P2 is 6, and you're still going to buy 100, right? As you can imagine, this is what we would call perfect inelasticity. Perfect inelasticity, right? In other words, the quantity demanded, that sucker's not moving, right? And in theory, you could increase the price quite a bit. Now, the one thing I do want to harp on, again, is that this is all in the short run. All short run stuff, right? All short run stuff, okay? Now, as in the long run, you keep jacking up the price, people will find ways to change, right? They'll find the substitutes that might not have been close, easy to get and work right away. They'll find them. They'll find something else. Technology will change. Some entrepreneur, some innovator will find a way to fix this. So all in short run, all right? All in the short run. But notice, and by the way, even if I drop the price, all right, let's call this P3. So even if it's $1, you're still buying 100, right? Even if it's $1, you're still going to buy 100. Okay. All right. Let's see what. Yeah, we'll go ahead and erase the whole thing. All right. Give you some time to kind of give yourself a new graph here. Okay. All right. Let's go with another one, right? Same thing, price, quantity demanded, that hasn't changed at all. And we'll go with roughly the same. All right, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And we'll go 20s down here. Excuse me. Okay. All right. Now, let's start with, we're going to go with, all right, I'll give you the point. Price for, quantity demanded, 120, all right? And let's go 5 and 80. Okay, now, right? Think about it. We were this way in the first graph, perfect inelasticity, things starting to flatten a little bit, right? Okay, now not a whole lot, but let's go ahead and draw in, let's go with some purple here, all right? All right? But, let's go for a little bit of green here. Okay, now what we could do, maybe I shouldn't use blue there, so let's go with a little bit of light brown. All right. Okay, so there's your demand curve, right? Okay, now remember, we're not moving the demand curve, right? The demand curve stays just where it is. All we've done is change price and quantity, right? We didn't raise, for instance, income level for everybody in the population. It doesn't matter, right? We didn't need to do that. Okay, so what we did, right? Let's make this clear. This is going to be P2, right? And because we use maroon or purple or something like that. All right, that was P1. So essentially, the price movement was this way, but also, right, demand shifted. You raise the price, people want less of it, okay? Now, it just so happens, this is, I'm going to write it in right here, all right? This is what we call unit elasticity, all right? And essentially, we won't go through the math, right? It's 1, right? The elasticity figure, right? Elasticity of demand figure, if you will, is essentially 1, okay? Now, we'll play around with that a little bit. Now, by the way, unit elasticity